Over the last couple of years, AI has turned into a spend race. Enterprises are pouring millions, even billions of dollars in proprietary models, GP clusters, and AI pilots. And as we have seen, most of these pilots fail. But a new working paper from the Linux Foundation suggests something surprising or not so surprising. By not using open models more broadly, organizations may be leaving tens of billions of dollars in economic value on the table. If that is true, this is not just a technology choice, it is a strategic mistake. To unpack this paper, I am joined once again by Frank Nagle, Chief Economist at the Linux Foundation, to talk about this new working paper titled The Latent Role of Open Model in the AI Economy and what it means for how CIOs, CTOs, and CISOs think about their AI strategy. Frank, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. It's great to be with you. Looking forward to chatting.
Let's just quickly do a quick summary, quick overview of this new working paper, The Latent Role of Open Models in the AI Economy, and what it means for CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, or in general, any business. And in today's world, almost, I remember early days, we used to say, it doesn't matter what kind of industry you are in, you have to have software, right? Then we start talking cloud, and then of course Docker, Kubernetes, and now AI. So talk about the idea behind this paper.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the title says a lot, because we all know that there are open models and there are closed models in the AI economy, but it's been hard to really measure exactly how these are being used and exactly to what extent the kind of the share between open and closed models are. And so we were able to get some data on this, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we find this kind of latent or hidden value of open models that is there and is measurable and important to the economy, but actually, as you pointed out, is underutilized on many dimensions. So many companies, many individuals could be using more open models that are just as good or even better than closed models, and the closed models often are much more expensive. And so that's what we tried to do in this paper, is really think about how, just understand what's happening in terms of the AI economy and the models that people are using, but B, really measure and understand, this kind of long-running history with open source and the various reasons that people choose to use proprietary and closed source software. How is that playing out in the open model world?
Let's just talk about the elephant in the room. In this paper, you estimate that there are tons of billions in unrealized economic value from open model. Can you walk us through what's really behind that gap and how you arrived at that estimate?
Sure. Yeah. So we use data from a platform called Open Router, which many of your listeners may have heard of before, but it's essentially a gateway to LLM inference, right? So these large language models that are the backbone of a lot of the Gen AI work, there's many of them that are out there. And the Open Router acts as a platform where you as a developer or a user can easily say, today I want to use GPT-5 in the application I'm building, but tomorrow I want to use, Llama 3 or something like that. And you can easily swap between these. So that's useful for developers because it makes it easier for them to, go back and forth and test different models within their own applications. But as a byproduct, they make some of their data public on who's using what model, and we can actually, and how much. And so we can actually see that. And so what we end up looking at is something that we estimate is about 1% of the overall LLM API economy that's out there, which, in itself is a smaller piece of the whole AI economy. But we can really see at a very granular level who's using what model and how are they being used and how much. And also importantly, what are the prices of these models? Because unlike, traditional open source software, open models in the AI context, you can download them and you can run them yourself on your own servers. But instead, what we see in the open model context is that people will often kind of still run them on servers. And so you're still paying a bit for the compute power, even if you're getting the models themselves for free because they're open. So that's sort of the data set and the data that we're looking at. And what we see in this is that people are using are the closed models much more, right? So about 80% of the usage that's seen on OpenRouter are closed models, despite these models having much higher prices, about 6 times the price of open models on average. And often there's only modest performance advantages, right? So we do a whole bunch with using the various benchmarks that are out there for understanding the goodness or the performance of these types of LLMs. And we use a couple of different ones and are able to show that, yes, often the closed models have leading performance, but frequently the open models catch up very quickly. And that rate of catch up is actually getting faster to the point where the open models are catching up to the closed models almost within 3 or 4 weeks, right? So within a month. And so, when we think about all this in aggregate, the obvious question then sort of becomes, well, if the open models are almost as good and are much, much cheaper, why are so many people preferring to use the closed models, right? And so we kind of take that as a challenge, and that's something we're going to dig into further. But we see these variety of reasons why people may be doing this, and we're going to continue the work to try and tease them apart. So just to give you a sense of like what those reasons are, we can think about the benchmarks may not be measuring actual usage, right? So when we're comparing these models on benchmarks, it's not really capturing what people care about when they're using them. We can also think about something that's long been there in economics, which is switching costs. So, say you start using the GPT series and you're, paying OpenAI, whatever it is that they're charging, and then newer, better models come around, but it's hard for you to swap away from that, right? And so we see this in technology all the time, right? That these switching costs are, lead people to being kind of baked in and continuing to use the same technology they always have, even if they're upgrading the technology. They're sticking with the same vendor or platform or model series in this case. We also see some things like information frictions or security concerns. So people, may have concerns about a lot of these leading models are coming out of China, and all the kind of geopolitical baggage that may come with that. But even beyond that, we can think about people having the same concerns they had about open source software, where, if I'm using an open model that's freely provided, if something goes wrong, who am I going to sue, or who am I going to call for customer support, or these types of things, right? Whereas if you're using a closed model, you're not only paying just for what the model is doing, but you're paying for sort of the ecosystem that surrounds it, in terms of liability concerns and tech support and things like that. So we're actually probably going to gear up and run some surveys to try and actually dig into that. But at the very least, at the moment, what we're able to show is that if people that are using closed models swapped to open models that were better than what they're using on these performance benchmarks, we don't have to push everybody into open models. The ones that are using the leading cutting edge closed models and want that extra little bit of performance, they can stay on those. But if the rest of folks swapped to better performing open models that are cheaper, then they'd be saving themselves about $24.8 billion, right? And so that cost difference is quite large. And this is, that's the estimate we end up with across the economy. Which is substantial when we consider the estimates of the investments that are happening in AI, this year, right? And so that was our goal with this paper. It was not necessarily to, take some very strong statement on open is better than closed, but just to think about how the end users who may, be very aware of the closed models because they're better advertised or more prevalent in kind of the mind share, may be, unintentionally costing themselves more money when they could be getting similar or better performance for a cheaper amount.
As you mentioned, and that is true, but even when that much value is on the table, many organizations still default to closed models. As much as we love open source, as much we like open, but organizations, they always pick and choose what works for them. As there is a saying, use the right tool for the right job. In most cases, the right tool happens to be open source tool. But in your research, what is the single biggest reason enterprises keep choosing closed models over open models, even when open models are not only cheaper, but sometimes they are free of cost?
It's a great question, and so unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that because the data that we have doesn't let us understand why companies are using these models, right, or why they're choosing to use one versus the other. We're looking at getting some new data and running some surveys and things like that to dig into that. So hopefully, I will have an answer for that. But I do think that just anecdotally talking to companies, at least from what I've heard, there's kind of two big reasons, right? One is a misunderstanding and the other is sort of a valid, concern in my book. The misunderstanding is I've heard the phrase in talking to multiple companies, governments, organizations, things like that, that if we use open models, then our data becomes open as well. And that's like that to me is just a misunderstanding, right? I mean, you think about, actually in many ways, if you're running open models and you're keeping them in your own servers, then your data never leaves your own system, right? Your own firewall. Whereas if you're relying on external closed proprietary models that are running in the cloud or running on, some server somewhere else, then your data actually is leaving your environment, right? And so I think that's one common misconception is that open models mean that the data ends up being open or things like that. And it's actually quite the opposite. So if that's the rationale that companies are using closed models instead of open, that I would say is incorrect. They should, there's a misinformation there. Now, on the flip side, the point I made about thinking about support and liability concerns and what happens if something goes wrong, who's going to fix it, who's going to take the liability. There, I think there's a more reasonable business case to say, well, if we're using OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or whoever, then we're sort of offloading some of that risk of that, that if something goes wrong and something weird happens, then like we have somebody to call to help deal with that. Whereas in the open model space, at least at the moment, there's not really anybody to call in the middle of the night when something goes wrong, right? And so I think that's a big piece of why a lot of the businesses are deciding to use closed models is that they feel that there's more support for them. Now, that said, when I talk to startups where they care more about the cost, there everybody's relying more on the open models because the cost is just so much cheaper, and they care a bit less about the liability and the product support and the things like that.
Let's also talk about, some next practical steps. These reports, studies, they serve a purpose. Not only that we collect information what is going on, but we use that information to further improve things. For an organization that is already experimenting with AI, where is the low hanging fruit to start shifting from closed to open models without sacrificing quality, reliability, or supportability in production? Because sometimes these open models are not just cheap, they are free. So it's just like different tools for different. You cannot just look at AI as a big giant, what do you call it? Sledgehammer, yeah. So you can use open models for some purpose, proprietary models, or so. But how to get started? What are the low hanging fruits where they can start without risking too much?
I think that's a great way to think about it, right? And so I think, like any technology, especially new ones, a bit of experimentation can go a long way, right? And so I do think that, for companies that are trying to figure out what to use and what they should use, a little bit of experimentation can go a long way, right? And so do you care about, what do you care about? And then thinking about the priorities, do you as a company, what do you care about? Do you really care about the ability to, have tech support, have liability concerns, things like that, which very valid concerns? Or do you care more about the ability to tweak and tinker and play and be cost effective? And, that's going to lead you in one direction versus the other. And then the other thing too, I think that, independent of kind of the tinkering is just education, right? Like an understanding a little bit more about like the pros and cons of and the use cases of the open versus closed models, to think a little bit more about, what exactly do we need it for? And what are these bucket of models good at? And what are these bucket of models good at? Because I think that's often all too quickly people will just say, oh, like everybody's using ChatGPT, so that's what I should be using for all my AI purposes, right? And obviously, like, I use ChatGPT. I use lots of different AI tools, right? And so I think it's important to remember that like just because that's the one that's like the leader at the moment, that's not necessarily the one that is going to kind of carry the day in the long term, right? And it's not necessarily the one that's going to be the right tool for your use case in particular. And so I think really that evaluation of exactly what you need, education around what the options are out there, and then tinkering is sort of the three steps I would give companies, suggest to companies follow to try and figure out exactly what's the best solution for them.
A lot of open models, they also allow you to fine tune them based on your use cases, so you cannot do with a closed source model like I do a lot with my own work. I have put my own prompt there, the whole, I have not created any MCP because I don't need that, but I can refine the model so it over a period of time, like it knows that I'm journalist, the tone changes, it has all the data. You cannot do that with proprietary models as well. So what are the other things that you can do only with open models, not with proprietary, so that organization can dip their toes in those?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, and indeed, I think the ability to customize has always been a benefit of openness, right? Forget about AI, but go all the way back to the operating system. That ability to customize has been super important from the get-go. But I do think that that the closed models are making it easier to kind of train on data that's within your environment and customize and fine tune a bit. But we're seeing so much more of that activity happening with the open models on platforms like Hugging Face and internally at companies, that I do think that at least at the moment, if you're looking to build these sort of customized solutions, open is definitely the right path for you to build on top of. And I think I even a couple of weeks ago I was at an event where with some governments from Africa, and they were talking about how they a lot of the models as they currently exist don't handle African languages well, right? Just because there's less broad content on the internet and in those languages, and so they haven't been trained as well. And so they were talking about how they've actually been building on top of open models to train them better to recognize their local language, right? And I think that's a great use case of open models, is that you can invest a bunch of resources into this to really make a good model that fits the use case, in this case of a country level, for whatever it is you're trying to build, right? Whereas in a closed model, like they may get to that. I'm sure they will at some point. They'll train them better on various languages. But if you want that today, and you have the capabilities and the resources to invest in kind of building it at least a little bit yourself, but you don't want to start from scratch, then the open models are really the place that you can build those trained, fine-tuned models much more effectively on top of.
Can you also talk a bit about the fact that your findings suggest that price and performance alone does not explain current adoption pattern? If cost and, let's say, raw benchmarks are not driving decision, what is driving decision? Is it the the bias or awareness, trust, governance, a throat to choke, perceived risk, misinterpretation, misunderstanding, vendor relationship, monopolies, or something else, or all of it?
All of the above. All of the above. Yeah, no, the way we think about that $24.8 billion is that, economists, some of the assumptions we sometimes make are that everybody knows everything and is completely rational, right? And so, obviously that's not true in the real world. But if if the performance benchmarks were truly capturing everything we need to know about a model, and price was capturing, everything that was sort of reasonable about a model, then we would attribute that $25 billion to people just being irrational and just making decisions that don't make any sense, right? Now, that's not what we do. We don't say that that's the case. We say that there's these host of other reasons why it may make sense for people to adopt more expensive and less good, at least by the benchmarks, models. And so I think that, again, we in the paper, in like one of the final tables, we kind of split out those reasons into kind of valid reasons and perhaps like invalid reasons, right? And so the invalid ones are more of these things about not understanding that your data doesn't become open or things like that. Whereas the valid ones are, again, these types of things like the ability to have somebody to call if something goes wrong and things like that, right? And I think that the other way to think about that too is that we can also think about that as potentially the switching costs, right? So again, the open models kind of came out a little bit later, and so if people were already invested in OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, whoever, then they may have just sort of stuck with that, and we may be picking up on some just switching costs, right? Like we know that it's more expensive and less efficient to be using the closed models that we're using, but it would be so expensive for us to swap to the open models that we're not going to do it, right? And the argument I would make there is don't only think about the switching costs today and what it would cost you to fork everything over and work on new models, but think about the long term, right? And really think about what happens if one of these closed source companies goes bankrupt and disappears tomorrow. Well, then you're going to be forced to transfer over to something else, and you won't have control over the timing or anything like that, right? And so thinking about the long-term impacts of what models you're choosing and how you're setting up your infrastructure around those models is something that when I talk to companies, I often emphasize as well.
When we look at these open ecosystems, they do create value over time, but it does take time. Can you talk about uh, if we just draw parallel to the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, and a lot of other open source projects, how do open models fit into that longer history of open source value creation over time? But we do need some players where folks look at it and don't look at, hey, it's just a project sitting on Hugging Face, it may disappear today tomorrow, but actually there is an organization which is taking responsibility to ensure that these open models will continue to exist.
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think the huge difference, of course, between what we talk about in terms of open LLMs, open AI models, and things like that versus traditional open source is the whole notion of open weights, right? So there's something in the middle between closed and proprietary and fully open. And I think that's where the kind of this, banking on history is a little bit different, because take a model like Llama that's coming out of a company like Meta. It's a great model. It does lots of things very well, and it's open weight. But Meta is the only one developing it, right? So it's internally developed and then sort of opened, and the weights are open so people can use it freely and use it on their laptops or however they want to use it. And so that's a little bit different, because then you don't have the community kind of giving back to it and creating what we ended up with Linux and lots of other open source projects. And so it's a little bit different from that perspective. Obviously, we do have some Gen AI that is true open source by the OSI definition, that the code is open. Of course, the weights are open, but also even the training data is open. And so I think that's something that we're going to continue to see a little bit of tension, a little bit of back and forth. Is what is the path for these, especially the open weight models that are not fully open source, but still play this super important role in their openness compared to the proprietary and pecuniary models. And I think that's where there may be a little bit of divergence from the past of open source software. All that said, I do think that we'll see, again, as people better understand what they actually need and they become more educated and knowledgeable about the technologies, I think we will see a similar kind of path that we saw in open source software, that, as people come to understand all those things, they start shifting to open more, at least for some context, right? And so, as you pointed out before, like Microsoft Azure is, running on top of Linux, right? Or like Windows installs today have like Linux, pieces of it baked into it, right? And so I think that, that's probably the future where we're headed. But the question is kind of how long does it take us to get there, and exactly what does it look like on the other side, in terms of where are the use cases that we end up seeing open being dominating, and where are the use cases that we end up seeing closed dominating, as we've come to see in operating systems, applications, everything else that we know and love about software.
If there is a CIO, CISO, CTO reading your paper and wants to respond, what concrete framework or decision checklist would you suggest for evaluating where open models should replace or complement closed models over the, let's say, next 12 to 24 months? As you rightly said, it will take time to decide. And also, if you look at the the computing world, a lot of open sources there, a lot of proprieties there, but how they can start, what steps you would suggest them?
I would point them to that. Maybe we should have put this table at the front of the paper, but I would point to that table in the back of the paper. It's table 2, and it's potential explanations for open model underutilization, right? So we list out again these sort of like preferences versus information misconceptions. And I would encourage folks to like just run through that list, right? And think about, are we, why is it that we're, using proprietary and not using open, right? Is it the switching costs? Are we so baked in on the, and everything's built around the closed that it would be too expensive to move to the open? Or is it more things like the information friction? Of, we have this kind of risk aversion, and we don't want to, think about, any of these liability types of things. And so we're okay paying for that, more support, more liability coverage and things like that. And so I think those, I think we have 8 or 9 kind of things that, literally you could just run through in 10 minutes and think about like how does our use case apply on these 9 or 10 dimensions? And how should that lead us towards, being happy that we're using closed or thinking that we should be using open more? And so that would be the advice I would generally give.
Let's just assume that if and most of the enterprises policymaker, they will actually act on these findings and they will start embracing a lot of open models. How do you expect the AI economy to evolve? Once again, we can draw parallel with the Linux kernel and Kubernetes. What changes do you anticipate in market structure, innovation patterns, and the balance between open and closed models over the next 5 years? Also, we can also look at the global. Right now, it's a bit a lot of friction is going on. I don't want to get into the political thing, but a lot of organizations, a lot of countries, they want digital sovereignty. They will also want AI sovereignty. They don't want the AI to be hosted in a specific country. So how do you say this may play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's something that we anchor the paper by thinking about. We hear all these things that like AI is going to be this monopoly, or maybe, a couple of duopoly, a couple of companies that control the whole market. But we also see things like a year or two ago, the leaked Google memo that said, we have no moat in AI, and neither does OpenAI or anybody else, because of open models, right? So we have this sort of, broad continuum of, we see the world in this kind of monopoly and one company's controlling everything, versus the commodity market where there's so many open good models that, it's basically a commodity, right? Like, and there's no real business model around the models themselves. And so where we come down from, from the analysis that we do, is that we're likely going to end up somewhere sort of in the middle, where in some use cases, much like with open source software, in some use cases, we see the open models taking over, and we see kind of, a reduction in some of the profits that are coming from that specific use case, or from the creation of the models themselves, because all these good open models exist. And then the good news is that all the profits and everything can come from what's built on top of that, right? Just like we have with open source software today, whereas not all software is free, but there are all these business models that are enabled because open source exists, right? On the flip side, we may very well still see some closed models that start specializing, right? So you can imagine things like, I don't know, like healthcare, right? Where, they want to kind of have specialized healthcare focused models, and they want them to, make sure that they're, getting all the support they need, and there's somebody to call if something breaks or something like that. So we may see, still the existence of some of the companies that exist today, or new ones, and playing this kind of more, a slightly more nuanced role, than kind of the general adoption that we're seeing now, right? And I'd compare that to kind of the history of the operating system, where, we saw this dominant player in terms of Microsoft take over all pieces of the operating system, but then slowly over time, the open models, the open operating systems like Linux chipped away at that, and we found that, oh, actually on servers, it's probably better to be using the open models, but like perhaps on desktops, it's still better to be using, closed and proprietary software, right? That's more user friendly, easier to, to have somebody to call if something breaks and things like that. And so I think what we'll see in the, again, say the 5-year time frame is we will see a continued rise of open models, as well as, still seeing some dominant players in the closed space. But we'll see this sort of separation where people start using open models more for some things and closed models more for other things. And just like we did with the history of open source in general, we'll see that sort of bifurcation as people understand the technology better and understand their own use cases better as well.
Frank, thank you for joining me and breaking down the economic impact of open models. It is clear from your research that open models are not just a nice to have alternative, they are a major source of latent value in the AI economy. And the choices leaders make now will shape how much of that value they capture in future. Thanks for sharing these insights, and I look forward to chat with you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you.
And for those watching, if you are wrestling with AI strategy, model selection, and cost, make sure to dig into the Linux Foundation's work on open models and how it applies to your own environment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this interview with your team. Thanks for watching.